I believe we can go ahead and get started here. I am so excited about the folks we have joining us on a Friday afternoon. When you get attendees on a Friday afternoon, you know you're doing something right. It's hard to get people in. So I wanted to welcome everyone today to the second installment of this year's Higher Education Headspace series. This inaugural series this year is designed to provide educational leaders like yourself the opportunity to reflect with your peers on some of the major trends, challenges, and opportunities in higher education as we transition from the summer that is the tail to the previous academic year into the fall of the new academic year. I know some of us are already in that. Some of us are just ramping up and coming around the bend of summer into the fall. But we're really excited for this series. And then the expert presenters who have agreed to join us for this year to talk to you about not only their passion for education, but also the ways they're working with higher education leaders and the solutions that they're helping them to implement. With us today, we do have a man who's very near and dear to my own heart. He is the managing director of Bâton Global, a strategy leadership research firm based out of Des Moines. I'm going to let him do his own introduction and tell you why he's passionate about education and why he's passionate about what he's going to share with you today. And so, Wade, without further ado, I want to pass it to you and let you lead us through today's session, about which I am quite honestly very excited.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, Mary Beth. Welcome to the folks that have come in to participate today. I hope that you will be active, ask me questions as we go along. I do not see any need for some kind of formal Q&A at the back end. If you have something on your mind, please let it fly. As Mary Beth said, my name is Wade Britt. My interest in the education space stems from experiences that I've had running the academic operations of a very large online university in the United States, focusing on student acquisition and recruitment in the Middle East, Canada, and the Caribbean. Additionally, in the sort of non-accredited world, I've run sales, operations, collections, training software for a large online English language company called Open English that operates primarily in South America, but also further abroad in countries like Turkey. And then kind of rounding out that EdTech experience, I've run the ETS property Prometric. I ran their division in India that did credentialing. So I really enjoy a lot of different facets of education. I'm kind of fascinated by institutions of higher education. And I like taking experience that I had from my global logistics career with DHL, 15 years of running large multinational business units and really optimizing processes and thinking about how can we take lessons from other industries and try to apply them into higher education to help meet the challenges that higher education institutions are having today. So with that said, I am going to try to see if I can share my screen and we can move into the presentation. Is there anybody? Let's see. Trying to see where I can see. Okay, I can see the Q&A window. I'm not sure that I see the participant window, but is everybody seeing the screen okay?
I see it well, and I'm getting some confirmations. Yes.
All right, well, let's go with that then. So what we really wanted to talk about today was to talk about some techniques for better optimizing institutions' cost position. And really what we want to do is we want to try to surface techniques that have been used very successfully in other industries that promote better efficiency, but also even better quality and better customer experience. So we know that profitability has been an unpopular term in higher education, and it really can't be. In my interaction with a lot of different institutions of higher education or even private organizations that are in the education space, there's sometimes a reluctance to focus on how can we be more efficient? How can we deliver our services in a way that better suits our learners, but is also better for us and helps us be more healthy as an organization? And I think the forcing mechanism here is just going to be what's happening today in the industry. There are a lot of shortfalls, whether you are a private institution that is seeing decreased state supply to your funding, or private institutions that are having trouble with their usual funding mechanisms. There's just a lot of challenges out there about getting the funding for the way that higher education works. I think it's also worth kind of pointing out that higher education's been a little slower than other industries to adopt data transformation efforts, so that kind of You're getting a lot of pressure now, and the industry as a whole is a little bit on the back foot. So what I wanted to do today was share with you two different techniques that might be able to help. Things that we've seen work very successfully across other industries, using fully allocated cost models to segment how you serve the different stakeholders that you serve and really understand that in a dramatically different way than most people are used to looking at financial data. And I want to talk a little bit about centralization of operating models, because a lot of higher education institutions are quite distributed. And as a result, they have built out a lot of distributed organizations. And there's a lot of lessons we can learn from other industries about how we might be able to optimize that to not only improve the financial health of the organization, but really improve the services that are being delivered. So with that said, I'm going to just kind of jump right into the first one about how do we really try to understand our sources of cost differently? How do we translate this different understanding of cost to the different kind of communities of learners that we serve? And to hopefully this sort of analysis can promote a better idea of like, well, where can we experiment? Where can we kind of play around? So I'm going to walk you through this sort of different conception of how to absorb financial data, and then talk a little bit about how that might be able to generate some new ideas for how institutions do the wonderful things that they do. I'm going to explain a little bit in the subsequent slide about what I mean about fully allocated cost models. Financial data is often parsed out in unhelpful ways. And I'll explain what I mean by that in some subsequent slides. But at the super high level, there's often a focus on, if you think about an organization and its finances, there's a focus on like the gross margin rather than the net margin. And people often forget about the importance of allocating G&A costs when they're thinking about what are we doing, how are we doing it, and how effective are we at it. Higher education is very interesting because, the operating model, it is a little different than other industries, but the learning model is the operating model. It's like we know that the mission is to supply services to help educate our learners and to involve and uplift a variety of other stakeholders. So a lot of these lessons from other industries apply very nicely to higher education. And the moment is kind of right for thinking about things differently because they're just headwinds with you name it, man. Demographic changes, inflationary pressures, people are a lot more value conscious. And the technique that I'm going to walk you through is a technique that is used a lot in private equity, venture capital, to really assess what's going on in an organization, understanding those sources of cost and sources of revenue to better figure out, like what segments do we want to lean in on more that are going to help us be more stable and successful? And what are those segments that we maybe need to reevaluate how we serve them to be able to do so more effectively? So on this slide, you've got a couple of charts to the right. And this is kind of the meat of it in terms of understanding the difference between a fully allocated cost model and financial reporting that doesn't really tell you a whole lot. No matter what industry I've worked with clients in, these patterns that I see in this financial data is almost always the same. And if you look at what is here in the center, I'm showing you a typical way that an organization reports their financial results. You will have A, B, and C, right? This is very sanitized and anonymized. But the idea that there are different segments of folks that you serve. And if we think about in this example, perhaps A is a school of business, and B is a school of medicine, and C is a school of arts. There could be any different number of segments. It could be undergraduates and associates and graduates. But this idea of you want to identify the different segments of learners that you're really trying to serve and really get down into that, like the sum of the cost to acquire, cost to serve, and cost to teach. And there's a lot of, standard data that is reported by educational institutions. And it all kind of falls into this same trap that other industries have fallen into over the previous decades, where we really want to focus on our allocated costs, which would be, for example, if it's the School of Business, then it is these just very School of Business specific costs, not really paying attention to the rest of the institution. And you can see that when you look at allocated cost only, you always get this sort of moderately happy picture, right? At the gross margin level, we're doing pretty well. Look at this. We've got, a 30% return. That should help us be successful as an organization. And everybody kind of gets their allocated cost models in line with their peer departments. And then they kind of forget about it. We all sort of look the same. Everything's just fine. The problem comes from this big chunk of unallocated cost, what is often in the G&A portion on P&Ls of organizations. And it's really important, if you want to dig in and understand what's going on with these different communities of folks that you're serving, to fully allocate the cost model. And when you fully allocate the G&A to the different units that you want to examine, what we typically see is that's where the wild variance comes in. You're going to find that a segment is absolutely killing it and is being very effective. You're going to find that some are kind of bleeding and are costing the institution, and maybe some are just a little bit marginal. But it's like in every instance when I've run this kind of exercise, I have taken this picture from, oh, look, everything's kind of fun and everything looks well and we're doing okay and we're all about the same. And then you load in the full cost picture and then you start to see, all right, we've got some opportunities here that we can perhaps focus on to improve things. And I'll take this example a little bit further with what we kind of call the whale's tail. And this curve is just so pervasive in analytics that we do with organizations around their sources of cost and margin that we slap a little graphic on the end because this curve always looks like a whale. And on the bottom side, you have your proportion of the folks that you are serving, right? So for institutions of higher education, these are going to be your learners. And up here, we have kind of like your financial results expressed as margin. And what we always see is that there are segments of the folks that we serve that very, very rapidly contribute to all of the margin the organization creates. And there are different sectors of folks that you serve that either marginally expand profitability while expanding quite a bit of scale. And then you start to get into folks that increase your complexity while they're increasing your scale. And then ultimately you find the segments of the populations that you're serving that actually pull margin away from the institution. So by organizing the way financial details are reported and the way that people understand them can really help to sharpen people's attention to maybe what matters and to get a little bit creative about how do we serve these people more effectively, more efficiently, so that we can do so and still contribute to the health of the organization. What these exercises tend to do is it really just changes the way that people look at numbers. Folks often running organizations, schools within institutions of higher education, there's a little bit of a desire to get these kind of top line, big P&L lines, so looking good for their area and then kind of hands off, and I'm not that worried about it. But our institutions, in order to really be sustainable and to deal with the kind of demographic and exogenous headwinds that we have facing us, there's really got to be a better understanding of where are we acting very efficiently that contributes to the health of the institution and gives us better sustainability. Where are we struggling a little bit? Where are we adding more complexity in, and how do we want to manage that? And then just where are we kind of falling down? And to have more open discussions about how can we leverage technology on the far end of the whale's tail to improve the cost to acquire, the cost to serve for the learners that we want to help, so that the organization is able to move to a better place of sustainability. So I'm going to pause right now because I'm conscious of the fact that I've been talking a lot. I feel like I've gotten through this sort of first chunk of how across different industries we're able to segment things, fully allocate the costs to really understand, or are we kind of winning or losing from a sustainability point of view with these subpopulations, and then using that information to drive better and more focused conversations for how we might want to evolve, modify different learning models, differentiate our use of technology so that we can better serve our learners and improve our sustainability. So I'm going to stop and see if there's any questions there before I might move on to the second topic.
And just to comment to attendees, as you came in, you were automatically muted, but I have given you all permission to talk through Zoom. That's actually what it's called, like permission to talk. So if you want to ask questions, you can come off mute and ask those at any time, as Wade said.
Yeah, I don't know that I'm seeing. Well, wait a minute. I do have the Q&A up. Okay.
Yeah. And
Advice on how to communicate changes to department heads on cost allocation. Yes. In my experience, it is very common that most leaders are a little bit uncomfortable with P&Ls, especially sort of the G&A section and how to think about it. I think it's very common that, you go to, when you learn finance, you learn all about your, revenue, cost of goods sold, G&A, profit, and folks are really focusing on their revenue and cost of goods sold. And what we're trying to do is to get them to focus on the G&A as well and understand how that impacts the whole picture. So a great way to communicate it is you're going to have to work with the different business unit leaders in helping build an understanding of how the different G&A lines should be allocated across particular business units. Because a lot of times there are things that might live in G&A, leadership, communication, there's education, there's marketing, there's a lot of things that can be there that actually focus on particular business units within the institution, or maybe they are common goods that go across the whole institution. So having a really good detailed line-by-line conversation with the G&A about where is this actually going? Is this something that helps the whole institution? Is it something that focuses, say, on the STEM schools? Is it something that focuses on advancement? You're able to pretty quickly get some good estimations of how to allocate different G&A lines. And it also really starts to help people think a little differently about the business, about where these sources of cost are coming from and what are we actually getting from them. Okay, so it is a standard feature to offer individual and personal lessons for instrumentalists. This is not economically efficient as a large lecture section as a class. Are you saying that there should not be music programs in universities? No, I'm not trying to introduce this as a technique for restricting any kind of program at any kind of institution. The point is to really understand for what you're trying to provide to the learner, do you understand the costs that it entails? Do you really understand it? And how does that impact whether it is the revenue that you need to charge for it, for people's tuition, or alternative sources of funding to be able to get it? But it is really just trying to understand how to make these things more sustainable, because there are going to be very, very different economic dynamics in different segments. And that could be schools, programs, or different populations of learners, even different credentials or certificates that are being done. But really being able to go in and look at how the institution is performing across different subpopulations will just raise the financial acumen of your leaders across the board and get people thinking in ways that are going to improve sustainability. I hope I answered that one okay. Maybe if you could let me know in the Q&A chat if that was a sufficient answer, if you feel like I didn't quite do it for you. I'm going to look under the next one. The focus on G&A is a primary reallocation method that underlines the responsibility center management model. I think I understand the question. I think you're understanding what I'm trying to put across. It's just that when we all, as maybe unit leaders, or when we're thinking about how we motivate or communicate and the information that we give to unit leaders, they're in this conception of revenue that my unit is bringing in, costs that my unit, this just cost of goods sold only, very direct, very sort of transactional, only my unit view. And that tends to hide the other costs that are required to support that unit. And that's, kind of why G&A was done. Hey, it's all over here and there we go. But that's just grown a lot, especially with institutions of higher education over the last few decades. And by hiding it that way, it's kind of preventing people from really understanding the full picture of what's going on with units within the greater institution context, because that's got to be the most important thing, is the survivability, the sustainability of these institutions, and how do we help them thrive And I really think it's got to come from some different perspectives of how we measure models of finance. All right, that was my best swing at that question. I don't know if you felt that that was a valid answer or just a bunch of rambling from a guy on a screen, but I'm certainly happy to dive in further if there's any other detail on that particular method. I don't know that I can see chat outside of Q&A. Mary Beth, are we
Yeah.
maybe move ahead?
Nothing else in the chat. I think we're good to go. And yeah, thank you, Wade, for keeping us going here.
All righty. So we're going to change tack a little bit. The first section really dealt with, we've been looking at our numbers a little bit wrongly with the classic revenue, cost of goods sold, G&A, then net margin. And we want to try to give people a better view into the holistic impact of what we're doing in support of learners. What I'm going to move over and talk to now is something that I'm seeing just a lot of movement in across different institutions of higher education, and that has to do with like centralization. The drive to seek more efficiency through centralized process models is something that has happened across a variety of other industries in a variety of different timing, right? And the good news about that is that there's just a lot of information out there about it, right? There's a lot of lessons learned about it. And what we can see for institutions of higher education, particularly state systems, there is a lot of activity around how do we centralize, optimize, make things more efficient. And, there's a lot of other exogenous reasons of why this is happening. We know we have workforce challenges. And I want to introduce an idea that might not be readily apparent, but when we think about making our processes better, when we think about improving their efficiency, that can't be the only aim. This can't be something that people do simply to save money, because the quality of the output is paramount. That's the most important thing, is the quality of what's being delivered to the learner. But several times when there is centralization that is driven from a cost-cutting perspective, the emphasis is more on the cost rather than the quality. And we're going to walk through a methodology that incorporates both of those, because they are intertwined and they're incredibly important, and they have a wonderful symbiotic relationship, because the more efficient processes get, provided you're keeping an eye on the quality levels, you have these wonderful benefits with the folks that are actually doing the work, your faculty and staff, attraction, retention, and engagement. We do a lot of large population workforce studies, and there is a very strong correlation between the efficiency of work processes. When people comment on their level of satisfaction with the degree of effective work processes in their organization, the higher that score is, the higher retention and engagement are. So we know that by making our processes better, we're actually making the folks that we depend on to do the work happier and more performant. So this is something that we have seen maybe mismanaged in some ways because of the emphasis on, oh, we really just need to do this to save money. And I wanted to just outline an approach that caters for the quality of the output as well. It caters for different organizational styles that might befit a particular institution better than others. And it's right here on this slide. When institutions of higher education that might have a very distributed model, and here I'm thinking maybe of a classic state system where you could have, a dozen, 2 dozen different entities around a large distributed geographical area. A lot of these folks are thinking about, well, how do we centralize? How do we optimize? How do we get more efficient? The sort of steps that we recommend for this is, there is a particular way of doing this analysis that is going to be helpful to you. And it starts with establishing drivers for the different areas that you're thinking about. And I'm just going to use this example of maybe decentralized career services at a large state system, just to have something to kind of hang on to, right? These services might be being provided at a variety of different locations in a variety of different ways through a variety of different staff. So what we really want to do is we want to get our hands around what is the services they are providing. And I've got an example of this in the next slide that might make it a little more sensible. How much does it cost to provide all of those services? And what kind of qualitative measure do we have for that service? because that is the inventory that needs to be built across the different units. The next step is then comparing them all. You establish the drivers, the costing, and the qualitative measure. And at that point, it gets very easy from a data perspective to rank how these different areas are performing with the provision of services to the learners from an economic efficiency point of view, but also from a quality of service point of view from the learner. And when you're able to say, okay, we've got this service that we're providing it 10 different ways in 10 different places, and here's how it all stacks up. This is the one that performs the best from the quality of service point of view. That's probably the one you want to go with, as long as the economic model is not too out of line with the other ones as well. But it's like, that is the key data that needs to be pulled together to be able to foster this conversation constructively. You then identify that process that seems to be the best mix of cost and quality of service. And that's where you really want to drill into, how do you define that very well? Because ultimately what you're going to have to do is a pretty big training exercise to bring everybody up onto speed with how to do that process in the best way as possible. And then once you have that process understood, you can then kind of understand, what is that right organizational solution? I talk here about mothership versus mosaic. I'll explain that a little bit later on, but there are a couple of different styles that you'll want to evaluate once you have the processes determined. So establishing drivers and comparing the variance. What I've done here, I've just mocked up some nonsense numbers, thinking about career services at a large system where it might be distributed. And I'm trying to indicate that here by saying that obviously we're looking at career services is unit B, right? If it's a big state school system, they got 13 campuses, this is one of them. And we want to understand, well, what is the cost of that organization to provide those services? So this is kind of the starting point of saying, we're going to drill into an area of practice. We're going to understand where this practice is happening across different areas. And then what we want to do is we want to dive into it from a process point of view. What I would say is about a 10,000 foot view. This isn't a 30,000 way up in the sky. It's not going to be super granular at the ground level. But if you think about the things that might happen in an organization that provides career services, I can think of broadly about 8 different families of activity. So what I'm doing is I put 4 of them up here, right? What do our career services folks do? Well, counseling and advising is a part of that. That would be a high level activity cluster. We want to poke into that a bit and say, all right, what's inside of that? One-on-one sessions, we're going to do resume and letter reviews. There might be assessments that are given, career guidance meetings, and maybe even more kind of focused, tailored job search meetings. But it's this idea that for this line of service that we're looking at, we want to get 8 to 10 families of activity that are done so that we can get around 3 to 6 activities that we're going to measure. And how do we measure them? We want to understand for a given time period, and I know this is just example data. Let's pretend this is a semester, a term, or a year, but it's the idea that, okay, under this family of activities, this is the stuff we do. This is the stuff that we actually deliver. What's the quantity in a period of time? How many of these things have we done? What you would then want to do is, with the leaders of these functions, you want to get them and their team to give a reasonable estimate of how do they feel their time is broken down in performing these activities, because that's what enables you to arrive at a cost per unit. If you want to say that, well, in this particular location in unit B, for us to do a resume and letter review, it's a $74 cost. So that gives you a really clear, concrete, comparable means of understanding efficiency across how processes are being delivered in different places by different people differently. You want to use this information to kind of get everybody on the same page and say, hey, where's our cost per unit the best? Where's our cost per unit the worst? What's driving those differences? Why are we doing these things differently? And you want to align on what's going to give you the best cost per unit along with the best quality of service. And there's a lot of different ways of measuring this. I mean, there's these kind of happy and sad faces that people can do after they've completed a transaction, typical Likert scale, 1 to 5, or MPS. However you measure satisfaction of a service being received at your institution, we've got to take this into account as well. I would typically, when we pull these together, because what I'm doing right now, I'm showing you one part of career services unit B, right? If there were 13 different career service units, we would want to compare them all together to understand what's the place that is doing the better quality of service with a reasonable, not the highest. It doesn't have to be the lowest, but you certainly wouldn't want it to necessarily be the highest cost per unit. But you want to get that sort of Goldilocks sweet spot in the middle on the cost per unit that gives you a really high quality score. And you can kind of unpack that with the leaders of the different areas to say, well, like, these are the ways they're doing this. This is how we're able to achieve this efficiency and this quality, so that you're able to kind of get to the point of, hey, if we're going to do, resume and letter review, this family of career counseling and advising, what is that playbook that we should use across the whole system to make sure that we're being consistent, we're delivering a high level of quality, and we understand our cost structure. When you've arrived on that winning combination, right? What is that process or set of processes that is delivering us high quality and reasonable cost? This is where you really want to get down into kind of lean methodology of documenting a process map and flow. I don't know for the attendees your level of familiarity with business process maps, but the idea is that you have an end-to-end process. You have the different steps involved and decision points that are involved. But what you really see with these swim lanes are how different people are brought in to deliver the total service. So we really want to make sure that we build a picture like this that represents the different people that contribute to the process and how they interplay together. We would also then want to take some of these different process steps, like any of these sort of decision steps, the different roles that might be involved, which would align to these swim lanes, go into this sort of racy, responsible, accountable, consulted, informed methodology to understand that to really make this process work well, we have to understand which role has the decision, has the responsibility or the accountability, and then which ones are, consulted, we get information from, and which ones are simply informed. But this is kind of the ideal way to document that winning process so that it is able to be trained out and managed effectively throughout the institution. And then that brings us this sort of fourth step in the picture of, well, how do we do that within our organization? Because, we'll often hear questions from folks like, oh, we've got all these distributed processes happening, and there are people everywhere, and everybody's working hard and doing the best they can. How do we make some more order out of this and have it be more efficient and effective? And there's not a, capital R right answer, but there are two very different models. And oftentimes there are things that have to do with either the culture of an organization or maybe even just the reality of the physical CapEx, locations that are there with an institution. But thinking about these two different approaches and what's good about them and how that might fit or not fit your organization better. If you take that sort of state school example of, 13 different campuses and career services, some of those maybe need to be delivered face-to-face, some of them not. You're able to then look at, if we figured out this is the process we're going to do, this is how we're going to do the process. Do we want to do it like all together, all in one place? This is sort of the mothership approach. You get some economies of scale with management. In terms of the cost of managing, it's a little more cost efficient in a centralized organization than it is if it's decentralized, because you necessarily have more kind of managers per person in a decentralized organization. If you're fortunate enough to maybe have some good physical plants, some good locations, that might also steer you towards this idea of centralization so you can get people more in one place. and hopefully manage them more effectively. The other way of standardizing and improving the efficiency and effectiveness of processes is to use what we call like a mosaic approach. There are 13 different locations providing career services in this hypothetical state school system that I've used going through here. You don't necessarily have to say, oh, we're pulling everybody to one of these locations. It might be that some of these different service lines, maybe the folks that produce all the content for workshops and seminars, maybe it was Campus F that performed best for that. Maybe they should do it for the whole system. And maybe if Unit B was the one that did this counseling and advising the best, then maybe those are the resources that need to provide those services. So the mosaic is a little more complex. It does require a little more management in terms of systems that you have in place and how you really want to have a good handle on data to be able to manage these distributed locations well. But it can often be an easier transition for an institution where you've got these valuable, faculty and staff who are good and they're passionate about what they do, and all of them aren't going to go to a mothership. Is there a way that we can parse out different processes to these different teams, use them most effectively, but in a highly distributed manner? So that is the sort of second kind of technique that I wanted to surface and sort of talk through. And what I'll just kind of do is put up a little slide now and maybe invite some questions and comments of like, those are some ideas we've had of techniques we think that can work really, really well. Would love to hear what you think about them. Would love to learn from you. Like, well, maybe there are other things that you're doing at your institution or things that you're curious about. But please, I've yapped enough and I'd like to be quiet and hear some ideas from some other folks.
Thank you so much, Wade. I have the Q&A up. If anybody wants to put questions there, the invitation stands to come off mute, ask questions if you have any, or share any feedback that you may have about what we've seen today. As you guys think about what questions you may have, I wanted to ask one of my own, Wade, if you don't mind. So what would be, and I know you talked about at the beginning and you kind of mentioned throughout that this is something we should all be doing in our organizations periodically, right? It's just looking at how resources are allocated. But my question would be kind of twofold. So first, what would be the symptoms or the things that should be flagging for me as an institutional leader or the leader of school at a larger institution that this is something I need to pay more attention to, right? And a solution I might need to look into, and what would be the first steps to take?
That's just got to be the top line financial results, right? Mm-hmm. If the organization is in a place of sustainability where they're thriving and they are able to support all of their learners' needs to the level of quality that they feel is important, that there's no need to look at this kind of stuff, right? Mm-hmm. But it's where you find that you're in a bit of a rub financially, and you're trying to connect the dots between scarce resources and the aspirations for the services that you want to deliver to your students. Mm-hmm. Really unpacking how you're serving the learners and comparing the efficiency and quality is a great way to surface internal best demonstrated practices. If there's a state system that has 13 different campuses and they're all providing full services to students, I guarantee you there are some that are doing them better than others. So what better way to then identify the folks that have the best demonstrated practices, shine a light on them in a really clear and data-driven way, and use that information to encourage the rest of the institution to move in that direction so that the learners can be better served. The other element that we spoke about with the fully allocated cost models is just that institutions of higher education have had a rough decade and nothing's getting easier in the next couple of decades. And just like when things change in an environment and you need different skills, there is going to be a need for greater financial sophistication, for people to be able to connect those dots between what they're capable of delivering and the people that need it and to do it well. And, there's just a lot of other industries where this expertise has been developed, and we really should be borrowing a page out of that and see how can we implement this in our institutions? How can it make us less reliant on state money? or less reliant on donors if we can be more efficient and effective.
I really like that. And I'm going to continue until I see another question come in or I see somebody coming off mute. But I appreciate that. And I appreciated the question we got earlier about music programs, right? What I'm hearing, a couple of things with the answer that you just gave, and then some thoughts I've had as you've gone on. So, first of all, you're talking about there are technique, and everybody in academia, for the most part, is in some way, shape, or form a researcher. And we know that whenever we are iterating on methodologies, we're always like standing on the shoulders of giants, right? We're always iterating on what the researcher next to me has done or someone that came 4 years before me has done. And it's kind of the same thing. You're saying that there have been these techniques that have been evolved and developed and refined in different industries. And so the suggestion is not, hey, let's take those exactly as they are written on paper and put them, apply it here without saying, what's the nuance of higher education? It's saying, actually, let's take these techniques and let's thoughtfully and intentionally modify them so that they work for this type of nuance and for this industry in particular. And that is the beauty of working with experts who understand, the cost allocation or the models that you've been walking us through today. So I just had that thought as you went through of this is a great transferable methodology that would be contextualized to the higher education space. And that's what you're suggesting. The other thing that I thought too is, you're talking about service models. It may be an oversimplified example, but I have noticed I shop at Costco a good bit, right? And I go to Costco and overall you think, I'm buying in bulk, things are going to be more economical for my pocket, right? But soda, for example, is not something that or pop. I don't know how whoever is in the room, right? We've got Coke, soda pop. But when I go to Food Lion or Kroger, it's what they would call loss leader, for example. It gets me in the door. I'm able to get soda at a much reduced price, but then I might buy things that otherwise are going to be, because I'm already there and I came to get my, 2 Cokes for $5. I might buy something else there that is a higher price that they sell that actually helps them to recuperate that cost. And again, while it might be an oversimplified example, to go to the question about music, it's not what you're suggesting is not that we figure out, well, how much does something cost? And, just looking like bottom line, and that's what it is. And then we say, well, it's out of here if the cost to provide is more than what we're recuperating through our tuition, for example, or through the money that we're getting, but rather allowing us to understand what servicing does cost, how it is, as you were saying, how that might differentiate across different programs or whatever segment we might be looking at, whether it's geographical, programmatic, and so forth. But then we are able, because that segmented kind of cost allocation has been done, or that segmented kind of understanding of where servicing and costs are matching and mismatching, we can look holistically at the organization and then make decisions about how we bring things into a place of higher sustainability. Am I completely oversimplifying what you shared with us today?
No, I don't think so. It's just really reinforcing that we do have that clear picture of the economic dynamics of the organization. Typical financial reporting obfuscates those things. And you will have in organizations services that are relatively more or relatively less economically efficient than others. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. When I go back to this music example, music is always probably going to be a more expensive education to deliver than something that is maybe a little more cut and dry and regulated like accounting. There's not a qualitative judgment on that, right? If the institution is
Correct.
serving those learners, then those are the costs that need to be understood and borne. But to really have leaders understand a more useful way of thinking about their financial drivers will often, just in and of itself, people that have the right context and the right learning are more likely to do the right things. It's this exercise of educating people to give them guardrails to modify their behavior in the hope that you control your own financial destiny. Because what we really want to avoid for, folks that we work with and institutions that serve, the communities where we live, if this kind of work isn't done proactively, institutions might get to a point where they can't afford to have the agency over the decisions that have to be made. And that's what we want to avoid, is people that are backed in a corner, are just out of money, and well, just outcomes and acts, right? To just chop things. And there's not a real deliberate way of doing it other than just, oh, here's this number that's got to go. And these techniques help eliminate that. It gets you in a position where you're not forced in the corner, where you have this information. You can be more thoughtful. You can reallocate things or launch efforts that will help areas that are lagging a little bit so that you can drive your own ship and it's not driven for you.
Absolutely. Wade, I think that's a great message for all of us in higher education today. And particularly as we look at what's to come over the next 2 to 5 years. So thank you so much for this timely message and for the way you walked us through it as well and really broke it down. I see we are at kind of the time that we said we were going to take today. I see we've had some people drop. We know we're getting to the bottom of the hour. So thank you so very much, Wade, for your time and your expertise today. We definitely appreciate it.
Wonderful. All right.
Thank you all so much.